With about 1.6 billion adherents, Islam is the second largest religion on earth. Yet its followers represent less than 1% of the world's scientists. Only a handful of people from Muslim-majority countries have won Nobel Prizes in science. However, up until the Mongol siege of Baghdad in 1258, Islamic science was the most advanced in the world. In comparison with the past, the modern disparity is staggering. Thus, to understand the present-day lack of scientific accomplishments, we must explore the past. In this installment of a new series, we will go over the rise and decline of Islamic attitudes towards science. My name is Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. If you want to support more original content like this, visit patreon.com/Caspian Report for more information. In pre-Islamic times, merchants from Africa, Asia and Europe traded along ancient routes and exchanged goods for coins, materials and other products. The most valuable commodity was silk. It was so precious that it was often used as an exchange currency. Silk was a luxurious item that universally represented power and wealth. It was so valuable that the world's largest trading route was named after it. The Romans and Persians had explored the Silk Road and constructed the required infrastructure to support and facilitate the incoming trade. However, since both sides had been preoccupied with war and conflict, the full potential of the Silk Road never materialized. In the 8th century, the Abbasid dynasty overthrew the Umayyad nobility and inherited the Roman and Persian empires. Just like that, the Arabs came in possession of an empire that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the fringes of China and India. The absence of old political barriers enabled commodities and ideas of former civilizations to spread and interact with each other. As caravans traveled along the Silk Road, they exchanged Egyptian glass, Persian saffron powder, Turkoman stallions, Tamil steel, Chinese lacquerware and porcelains, and much more. At the heart of the Silk Road was the Abbasid Empire, meaning if the Romans wanted to import Gujarati sandalwood or Nubian slaves, they had to travel along the Abbasid checkpoints. To cope with the surge in commerce, the Abbasids founded new centers of trade. Cities along the Silk Road flourished, such as Balkh, Samarkand, Tabriz, and more. It is in this era of history that the lavishly wealthy and diverse city of Merv became known as the Mother of Earth. Meanwhile, its competitor, Rey, nowadays located within Tehran, was referred to as the Gate of Commerce. Yet perhaps the city that stood out most was Baghdad. Al-Mansur, the second Caliph of the Abbasid Empire, had built the city at the site where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were at their narrowest crossings. It was such a success that the Caliph proclaimed Baghdad as his capital instead of Damascus. On that account, the new capital grew into a metropolitan center with parks, bathhouses, bazaars, mosques, schools, courts, forums, and even hospitals. Public life in the city was surging. By the end of the 10th century, Baghdad would become the largest city on earth. As cities flourished in private enterprises, a hunger for knowledge, fine craftsmanship, and exotic foods surged throughout the Abbasid realm. It was one of the earliest forms of globalization. People wanted to wear new clothes, taste different foods, and display exotic items. One of these exotic commodities was Chinese paper, which proved to be exceedingly useful for the vast Abbasid imperial bureaucracy. So the rulers set up paper mills in cities such as Basra, Alexandria, and Baghdad. And over time, writing materials became more affordable and more available. Subsequently, the availability of paper encouraged record-keeping, banking, poetry, and even scholarship. As literacy increased and books became a common item, it was no longer required to conduct manual labor to ensure a livelihood. Scholars could make a wealthy living by writing new ideas and books. As a result, an intellectual revolution ignited and the market for information surged. Since the Abbasids had started out as a Persian nationalist revolt, The dynasty shared many of the Sassanid traditions, including maintaining a vast imperial library. Thus, the availability of cheap paper contributed to the expansion of the imperial library of Al-Rashid. The Caliph employed scholars to translate Greek, Chinese, Sanskrit, and Persian works in the field of physics, chemistry, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, geography, and other faculties into Arabic. Advances in technology helped to solve everyday problems. For instance, the study of astronomy and trigonometry helped to determine the direction to Mecca, the times for prayer, etc. Technological process also improved engineering techniques and even sparked an agrarian revolution. As scholars worked tirelessly to translate every available scientific text, the Abbasids, without even realizing it, had successfully globalized knowledge. Eventually, this massive undertaking would become known as the translation movement, and it established Arabic as a scientific language of antiquity. As the movement gained momentum, the Abbasid Empire, which was already known as a military, economic, and cultural powerhouse, also became an intellectual haven. To that end, ambitious scholars who sought peace and stability for their research immigrated to the Islamic world. One such family was the Barmakids dynasty from Balkh. The household of Buddhist origins became known for their patronage of physicians and the study of medicine. Another dynasty was the Buktishu, a Christian family of surgeons who helped translate the Zoroastrian and Sassanid studies, either way from Italy and Scandinavia to China and India. If you wanted to pursue science, the Abbasid Empire was the place to be. The quest for scientific achievements accelerated during the reign of Al-Mamnun, the seventh Abbasid ruler. He converted Baghdad's imperial library into the House of Wisdom and thus established a formal institution of learning. He also placed the physician Ibn Ishaq in charge of the translation of foreign scripts. Ibn Ishaq was such an accomplished translator of Greek knowledge that he is often referred to as the Sheikh of translators. In any case, the House of Wisdom was the most ambitious educational undertaking since the foundation of the Library of Alexandria. It was the Silicon Valley of the Abbasids, and it ushered in the Islamic Golden Age. As time passed, more state-funded centers of learning, or madrasas, were established in the realm. Cities such as Nishapur, Bukhara, and Kabul became centers of learning. With the right people in charge, the accumulation of knowledge flourished. Some of the great minds of this era include Al-Khwarizmi, who combined the works of Greek and Indian scholars and made enormous contributions to the algebraic method, and Ibn Hayyan, who made his renowned accomplishments to alchemy and strongly influenced the course of European chemistry. This was also the era of Al-Tabari, who wrote the historical chronicle of the history of prophets and kings, which serves as a crucial source for the history of the Middle East. Other important figures from this era include the Banu Musa brothers, who made mechanical devices and worked on the foundation of geometry. Women too surged in the sciences. Take Al-Fihri, Al-Astrolabi, Lubna of Cordoba, and Al-Mahanli, who all exceeded in mathematics. In any case, as the Abbasids came in contact with Greek philosophy, Indian numeral system, Persian rule of law, and other Chinese and Roman studies, the scholars became genuine students of Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, Brahmagupta, Sushruta, and others. It wasn't long before Persian and Arab scholars adapted foreign ideas and improved on those concepts. One example was the assimilation of Neoplatonic philosophy and Aristotelian metaphysics in the Islamic context by Al-Kinda, who is unanimously hailed as the father of Arabic philosophy. The translation movement is mostly lost in the modern educational curriculum, but it's an acknowledgement that the receptiveness of the Muslim rulers and scholars to foreign ideas was the primary catalyst that paved the way for the Islamic Golden Age. As the assimilation of knowledge ignited a trend towards Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism, a new collective of scholars emerged. Its students were known as the Mu'tazilites, and their doctrine was mostly based on ancient Greek philosophy but adjusted within Islamic context. A prime contention of the Mu'tazila belief was that the metaphysical world, which includes objects and properties, space and time, cause and effect, could be used to understand not just the physical world, but also the nature of God and creation. In other words, its members were united in their conviction that it was necessary to give a rationally coherent account of Islamic beliefs. What's more is that the group did not necessarily use the Quran and the Sunnah as the only sources of understanding. They believed that human existence was not predetermined and that humankind made decisions independently of God's will. As such, the Mu'tazilites believed in absolute free will. Nowadays, it is difficult to imagine this because the modern situation differs so greatly from the past. However, at the time, rational Mu'tazilism was the universal doctrine of the Muslim communities. In fact, the Mu'tazila creed was so appreciated that the Abbasid rulers formally enforced it. But it is easy to get away with the glory of the past. The truth is, the Islamic Golden Age was a time of prosperity and growing divisions. Rebellions broke out in Persia and North Africa. It was a time in which minorities such as Christians, Jews, and Shia Muslims were treated with tolerance and at times repressed. It was an era in which the global economy prospered due to the slave trade as well as the Silk Road. At the time, human trafficking was endorsed by every civilization on earth. The Turks were a group of people that were particularly in demand in the slave markets. Originally from Central Asia, the Turkish people were valued for their intelligence and bravery. In sequence with their archery and horsemanship traditions, it made them superb soldiers and diplomats. For their valuable skills, the Turks were enslaved, transported to the Middle East, and placed in the royal courts and armies of the Abbasid Empire. While the scholars were busy assimilating knowledge, Turkish mercenaries, often referred to as Mamluks, had climbed the ranks of the Abbasid army. By the 9th century, some Turkish Mamluks commanded entire armies, while others were entrusted bodyguards for local rulers and dynasties. It would not take long for the Turks to realize that they could just seize power for themselves. In the year 833, Khalif al-Mamnun, the 7th Abbasid ruler, saw an opportunity to acquire religious authority at the expense of the ulama scholars. He formally institutionalized the Mu'tazila doctrine and sought to eradicate other theological schools. As such, the Khalif enforced an inquisition known as the Mihna. Scholars who were employed in state-funded schools and madrasas were forced to profess their allegiance to Mu'tazilism and submit to the curricula of Neoplatonic philosophy and Aristotelian metaphysics. Those who refused were punished by lashing, imprisonment, or beheading. Al-Mamnun passed away in the same year as he decreed the Inquisition, but his policy was continued through his immediate successors. Most intellectuals submitted to the official Mu'tazila creed. However, a scholar named Ibn Hanbal from Baghdad refused to recognize the rationalist doctrine. He argued that the Quran was eternal and that it was not open for interpretation or innovation. Hence, the scholar and his followers rejected free will, metaphysics, rationalism, and subscribed to the literal interpretation of the Quran. Ibn Hanbal's theological view could not be more different than the Mu'tazilite scholars, who argued that the anthropomorphic verses in the Quran, which mention the hands, eyes, and face of God, indicate that the holy book should not be interpreted literally. Building on that, the Mu'tazilites stressed that the Quran was open to rational interpretation and innovation. In any case, for his defiance, Ibn Hanbal was imprisoned, tortured, and even banished from Baghdad. For over a decade, the Abbasid rulers tried to break the scholar, but in their pursuit, the Caliphs had inadvertently made Ibn Hanbal a folk hero. Over time, the Inquisition became unpopular with the people, and in some cases, riots erupted in the streets of Baghdad in support of Ibn Hanbal. Under these circumstances, in 847, Al-Mutawakkil ascended to the throne as the 10th Abbasid ruler. At the age of 26, he reigned over the largest empire in the world. Yet his authority was in question and he needed to swiftly restore his legitimacy. Thereupon, Al-Mutawakkil enforced a populist decision. The Caliph ended the Inquisition and effectively endorsed the literal creed of Ibn Hanbal. In the end, the defiant scholar had outlived 3 caliphs. As he was hailed a champion of Islam, Ibn Hanbal founded his own institution of theology that bore his name. This had a profound impact on the course of Islamic civilization. For one, religious authority became an exclusive purview of the ulama scholars, and the caliph's role was reduced to political authority. Second, Ibn Hanbal's defiance reduced the credibility of the Mu'tazila. As such, in the following decades, a backlash against Mu'tazilism spread across the Abbasid realm. And third, the end of the Inquisition facilitated the formation of more orthodox theological movements, many of which are still active. For instance, at the present, the Safa'is school is predominant in East Africa and Southeast Asia, while the Maliki school holds an influence in Africa's Maghreb and Sahel region. Meanwhile, the Hanafi curricula prevails in the former Ottoman territories and Central Asia. As for the school of Ibn Hanbal, in the 18th century it experienced a reformation in the Wahhabi Salafi movement, and therefore its influence is limited but predominant in Saudi Arabia. Anyway, Al-Mutawakkil, who ended the Inquisition, appointed his oldest son as his heir. However, over the years the Caliph shifted his favor to his second son. This rivalry extended into the political sphere as well. The eldest son, Al-Mutasir, was favored by Turkish slave soldiers, who at the backdrop of the scientific progress had turned from slaves to warriors to entrusted advisors and military commanders. Meanwhile, the youngest son, Al-Mu'taz, was backed by the traditional Abbasid elites. Al-Mutasir feared that his father was going to move against him, so he decided to strike first. The eldest son had his father killed by a Turkish bodyguard and became the 11th Caliph. But within half a year, the new ruler was poisoned and passed away. So the Turkish military leaders held a council and selected another Abbasid relative as the 12th Caliph. However, plots and treachery were all around, and within a few years the new Caliph abdicated power to Al-Mu'taz. The youngest son, who assumed power at the age of 19, lasted for nearly 3 years until he was betrayed, beaten, and left in the scorching heat without food or water, where he died 3 days later. This era in history is known as the Anarchy at Samarra, and what followed was a period of intense instability and violent successions of caliphs. As the Abbasid realm disintegrated from within, Turkish Mamluk slaves effectively seized power and reduced the authority of the Caliph to a ceremonial role. As such, in mid-9th century, rebellions popped up in every corner of the realm. In North Africa, a severe drought had resulted in food shortages. As a result, riots erupted in major cities in Tunisia and Egypt. The central government in Baghdad was incapable to provide for the basic needs of the remote settlements, and so local rulers substituted the central authority. In Egypt, Ibn Tulun, a Turkish Mamluk, took over the region's finances and established a military force that was loyal to himself. He became virtually independent and founded the Tulunids dynasty that extended from Egypt to Syria. Elsewhere in North Africa, the Aghlabid dynasty had effectively proclaimed independence and ruled over Tunisia, Libya, and Sicily. At the same time, in the Caucasus, the Sajids and the Shirvanshahs took over power, while the Anatolian lands were controlled by the Hamdanids. Further east in modern-day Central and South Asia, the Turco-Persian dynasties of Samanids and Safarids reigned over the land. But it wasn't just the remote frontiers of the empire that detached. Rebellions even erupted in the proximity of the capital. For instance, in Bashra, the Zanji people, who were East African slaves transported to the Middle East, revolted against their Arab overlords. At least 500,000 people lost their lives, and it was one of the bloodiest rebellions in history. In the same era, a small group of radical Shiites, known as the Karmatians and sometimes called the Bolsheviks of Islam, sacked the holy city of Mecca and looted the sacred black stone from the Kaaba. Elsewhere in the realm, the radical anarchist Khawarji movement, which had been responsible for the Islamic civil war 2 centuries earlier, rejuvenated their campaign to overthrow the caliphs. Unrest, rebellions, and revolutions were everywhere. Within a short span of time, the effective control of the caliph was reduced to the proximity of Baghdad. However, the decay of the Abbasids did not hinder the intellectual process. Since education and art had become a fabric of Islam, many of the powerful regional dynasties continued their patronage for scholars. As a result, brilliant intellectuals emerged all over the Islamic world. One of the most comprehensive thinkers was Al-Farabi, who made enormous contributions to physics, chemistry, mathematics, and psychology. He also excelled in philosophy, ethics, and music. For his wide range of accomplishments, Al-Farabi is known as the second master after Aristotle. Another brilliant mind was Al-Haytham, who wrote extensively about astronomy, mathematics, optics, and visual perception. He established the modern scientific method and thereby became the first legitimate scientist in history. The Golden Age also saw advances in medicine thanks to Ibn Sina, whose work remained in use for the following 6 centuries. Yet many of the great minds of the Islamic Golden Age were also fierce critics of the literal interpretation of the Quran. For instance, Al-Biruni, who calculated that the earth revolved around the sun and rotated on its axis, challenged the literal creed of Ibn Hanbal by insisting that it was essential to question everything from religion to philosophy. The irrational position was shared by Al-Razi, who was a scholar of Da Vinci's magnitude and once argued that Islam without reason had no value. Then there was Khayyam, one of the most influential thinkers of the Middle Ages. He was a fierce patron of humanism and expressed secular ideas in opposition to the design of Sharia law. Another leading scholar was Ibn Rushd, who advocated for the emancipation of women and stressed that matters of belief should be decided only on the basis of reason and evidence. It was clear that the Mu'tazilites were fighting back against orthodox theology. However, the political circumstances were not in their favor. Despite their best efforts within a century, the great minds of the Islamic Golden Age would end up as dissidents. In the 10th century, a Mu'tazilite scholar by the name of Al-Ash'ari had a major disagreement with his teacher. He left the group and capitalized on the popular discontent against the Mu'tazila, which had been steadily gaining ground since Ibn Hanbal's Inquisition. In the following years, Al-Ash'ari became one of the most distinguished opponents of the Mu'tazila. He used the philosophical methods he had learned and gathered a following of distinguished former Mu'tazilites. The group, which became known as the Ash'ari, combined the jurisprudential arguments of Ibn Hanbal and the theological traits of the Mu'tazila. As such, the Ash'ari believed in rationalism and the open interpretation of the Quran. However, the group gave precedence to predestination and argued that reason was subservient to revelation, meaning rational thought and free will could be applied as long as it did not conflict with the sacred texts. This was at odds with the Mu'tazila, who believed in absolute rationalism and free will. Over the course of the 10th century, Mu'tazilites, Ash'arites, and other theological schools debated and explored the existence of the universe. Hundreds of scientific works were written, as there were many lingering questions on how to interpret new ethical inquiries such as the meaning of revelation and humankind's responsibility. As the rival schools of theology debated the sciences, they often found themselves on opposite ends and accused one another as irrational and un-Islamic. The attempts to grapple complex scientific questions is at the heart of the declining attitudes towards science in Muslim societies. One of the most remarkable discoveries of the Mu'tazila concerned the smallest matter, the atom. In earlier centuries, Greek, Persian, and Indian scholars had explored the world of atoms as well, but it was the Mu'tazilites who had successfully combined all three sources and formulated their findings. Yet, what was one of their greatest achievements would turn out to be their greatest point of division. As theological schools explored the atomic world, it ignited a philosophical firestorm. The Mu'tazilites argued that atomic substances possessed properties and had the capacity to affect other properties. This reasoning supported the free will doctrine and emphasized that humankind created its own actions independently of God's will. The Ash'arites, on the other hand, supported the concept of atoms as well, but since they insisted that reason was subservient to revelation, the group took a different view. At the core of the Ash'ari doctrine was the theory of occasionalism, which denies natural causality. The Ash'ari stressed that as soon as an atomic accident was created, it immediately ceased to exist. There was no continuity between one moment in time and another. For instance, the shattering of a window and the skin color of a person was determined by God's continuous recreation of atoms at each instance in time. The Ash'arites argued that God determined the outcome of every single atom and that human existence was a series of events each willed by God. Essentially, the group suggested that cause and effect as well as free will were illusions because the existence of humankind was predestined. Such philosophic reasoning may seem strange now, but at the time the Muslim scholars were the first explorers of the atomic world. The concept of occasionalism became the fundamental building block that led the Ash'arites to deny the comprehensibility of the natural world. It also provided the group with a basis for what was their belief in predestination. It is not difficult to imagine how such a mindset in the span of centuries could influence the attitudes towards science. At the backdrop of the theological debates, the realm of the Abbasids underwent a period of disintegration. Powerful dynasties rose up in arms throughout the empire. Meanwhile, the ruling dynasty turned against itself as the Abbasid relatives openly challenged the seat of power. As rough as this sounds, it was about to get far worse for the Abbasids. In the mid-10th century, Egypt underwent an unusual heat and drought. The crops had failed and famine spread through the cities, which incited riots. An estimated 600,000 people starved to death. In Tunisia, a Shia Muslim dynasty known as the Fatimids took matters into their own hands and invaded Egypt, where they proclaimed a new caliphate. As such, in the 10th century, the Islamic world was decentralized along feudal lines, which included dozens of separatist regions, autonomous provinces, influential dynasties, and powerful Turkish Mamluk mercenaries. However, the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate established a third political stronghold in the Islamic world, the first two being Cordoba and Baghdad. The Fatimid dynasty sought to secure its future and sealed an alliance with Byzantium. To that end, trade between the two flourished. Fustat, Alexandria, and Constantinople became economic powerhouses. The tides of fortune were now reversed. As the Abbasid Empire crumbled from within, the Byzantines attacked and gradually recovered their territories. Crete and Cyprus were taken first, followed by the city of Antioch and Edessa. The revival of Constantinople dramatically altered the financial conditions. The wealth, trade, and taxes that once flooded the treasury of Baghdad now flew to the Byzantine capital. Along with the revival of Byzantium, Western Europe was recovering from the Dark Ages as well. As wealth and stability slowly returned to the European continent, people had taken a renewed interest in the life of Christ. As such, journeys to Jerusalem were being organized, and within a century, these Christian pilgrimages would lead to the Crusades. All in all, the circumstances were promising for Western Europe, the Byzantines and the Fatimids. For the Abbasids, however, the situation was desperate. The realm of the Caliph had been reduced to the proximity of Baghdad. In fact, in 945, the Abbasids had even lost their capital to the Buyids, which was a Shia Muslim dynasty of Persian origin. Under this state of affairs, at the turn of the 10th and 11th centuries, Al-Qadir, the 25th Caliph of the Abbasid Empire, condemned critical thought and ordered his subjects to distance themselves from the philosophers and freethinkers of the Mu'tazila. As such, Al-Qadir outlawed the Mu'tazila creed and endorsed the theology of Al-Ash'ari, as well as the jurisprudence of Ibn Hanbal. It's not certain what prompted Al-Qadir to condemn critical thought, since Islamic teaching, such as ijtihad, actually requires Muslims to self-reflect and raise questions. However, present-day historians argue that it was based on the political situation. The Caliph may have believed that the Ash'ari predestination would stabilize the realm and make the common folk more content with the injustices, famines, and corrupt authorities, since these were supposedly part of God's plan, whereas the Mu'tazila free will incited critical thought, which inspired rebellions and political unrest. To enforce his policy, Al-Qadir passed a law of apostasy. Prior to this, there were legal institutions that circumvented harsh punishment. As such, the Abbasid Empire had been relatively secular. However, the new decree made it easier to condemn and punish dissidents, skeptics, and minorities. On account of the law of apostasy, Muslim rulers persecuted opposition forces by altering the curricula of the state-regulated madrasas. In this context, the Mu'tazila teachings gradually disappeared from the educational system, while the Ash'ari sources became the basis of mainstream Sunni Islam. Since the remnant Mu'tazila scholars could not formally disclose their beliefs, most of them sought refuge in opposition movements such as the Shiites in Persia. There, the theology of the Mu'tazila would influence the Jafari, which was and still is the jurisprudential school of Shia Islam. In any case, Caliph Al-Qadir's reign lasted for 40 years, and despite his efforts, the Abbasid realm continued to decline. In the lands of Khorasan, in parts of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, a new contender was about to advance on the Islamic world. The Seljuk Turks were a highly militarized society and hailed from the rugged lands of Central Asia. Their warriors were accustomed to fight numerically superior opponents, and their skills of archery and horsemanship were unmatched. Turkish nations such as the Seljuks and Bulgars were introduced to Islam by Muslim missionaries who had blended pagan rituals with Islamic traditions, which brought a sense of mysticism to Islam. But this also made the mindset of the Seljuk Turks distinctly different from the Persian, Arab, and even Turkish Mamluk populations. By the year 1040, the Seljuk ruler Tughril assembled an army, overthrew the old dynasties, and conquered the Persian domain. Sensing an opportunity, the Abbasids invited Tughril to recapture Baghdad from the Buyids. As such, a decade later, in 1055, the Seljuks entered Baghdad. Since the Seljuks were new to Islam, their rulers didn't really care about the Ash'ari and Mu'tazila debates over theology and jurisprudence. So when Tughril took upon himself the title of Sultan and subjugated the Caliph, he allowed the Abbasids to decide over matters of faith. In addition to this, by conquering Baghdad, the Turks had become the new champions of Islam and so had to answer the call to war, the challenger being the Byzantine Empire. In just a few decades, the conflict between the Seljuk and Byzantine empires would lay the groundwork for the Crusades. And at the backdrop of these events, the scientific community of the Mu'tazila would be completely wiped out. In the mid-11th century, Sultan Alp Arslan ascended to the throne of the Seljuk Empire. Under his leadership, the Seljuk holdings significantly expanded throughout the area. But inevitably, Arslan encountered Romanos, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. In the year 1071, the two powers locked horns over the fate of the Middle East. Romanos assembled an army and marched to meet the Turks. But in an area called Manzikert, he was caught by surprise. Arslan's forces delivered the Byzantines an irreversible defeat. Not only had the Turks crushed an army that was at least twice their size, but the Byzantine ruler, the most powerful man in the Christian world, was captured alive. Arslan placed his foot on Romanos's neck and humiliated him. Then he raised Romanos from the ground and treated him like a guest. Eventually, after 8 days, the Seljuk ruler set his counterpart free. This point in history illustrates how well Arslan grasped the political dynamics. By releasing Romanos, the emperor was humiliated in Constantinople. His authority waned, and it triggered a series of civil wars within the Byzantine realm. As a result, most of Anatolia came under Turkish control, and in the course of centuries, the population assimilated into the Turkish identity. What's more is that Arslan authorized his generals, or atabeys, to carve their own principalities throughout the empire. Despite his military prowess, Arslan's reign came to an abrupt end when he was assassinated. His death triggered a succession crisis, and the Seljuk houses focused inwards. It is in this period that the Turkish Atabey principalities became virtually independent. Many of these principalities started exercising their sovereignties by attacking one another as well as by harassing Christian pilgrims. At the backdrop of the Seljuk crisis, most of the domestic affairs were left to the local political advisors. In the case of the deceased Arslan, the closest advisor was Nizam al-Muluk, a brilliant figure who wrote the Siyasat-Nama, or the Book of the Government, which is comparable to The Prince by Machiavelli. The Seljuk advisor, backed by regional dynasties, nobilities, and houses, established the Nizamiya Guild, which were educational institutions that were comparable with European universities. The Nizamiya represented the finest quality of education in the Islamic world, and the most splendid academy was the Al-Nizamiya of Baghdad. Al-Muluk was later assassinated by a member of the Assassins, which was a secretive group that adhered to the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam and used stealth, infiltration, and political assassinations to wage an asymmetric war against the Sunni Muslim rulers. For the Assassins, the death of Al-Muluk marked the first of many political assassinations. However, before the advisor perished, he appointed the distinguished Ash'ari scholar Al-Ghazali to supervise the academy in Baghdad. Few could imagine that in time this scholar would change the fundamental beliefs of Islamic civilization. Yet, while Al-Ghazali was preoccupied with giving lectures, another major event was about to disrupt the Middle Eastern affairs. By the year 1095, the Byzantines saw an opportunity in the Seljuk succession crisis. The new emperor Alexius wanted to strike at the Turks, but his realm was still in recovery, so instead he appealed to the West European kingdoms for aid. At the time, feudalism in West Europe had created a disproportionate distribution of wealth, power, and knights. For Pope Urban II, a military expedition to the Holy Lands presented an opportunity to strengthen his authority over the feudal kings, lords, and barons of Western Europe. Just as the jihad was a way to unify the Muslim world, so too was the crusade a way to bring the Christians together and exert internal force on the outside world. As such, in 1095, Pope Urban II, during a sermon in Clermont, convinced the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire to take up arms and embark on an expedition to Jerusalem. The Pope promised salvation for the participants, and the sermon sparked a wave of religious fervor. Inspired knights and lords took upon the cross as their coat of arms and later would be known as the Crusaders. However, before the nobles could gather their numbers, peasants and commoners in Europe assembled their own expedition and marched towards the Holy Land. Yet the careless undertaking of the peasants' army left them ill-prepared for the journey east. During their expedition in what became known as the People's Crusade, the peasants' army looted and pillaged Jewish, Christian, and even Byzantine settlements who were supposedly allies. By the time the 20,000-strong People's Crusade reached Anatolia, they were swiftly crushed by the local Turkish nobles. The speed at which the peasants' army was defeated surprised even the local Seljuk rulers, who mistakenly believed that the People's Crusade was the primary fighting force of Europe. The next year, news spread that more Christian armies were coming, but the Seljuk principalities were not impressed. They expected another army of peasants and, in their complacency, made no preparations. At the day of the battle, the Turkish nobles were stunned to see a 60,000-strong, well-trained and well-equipped army. The result was the defeat of the local Seljuks at the Battle of Dorylaeum, which allowed the Crusaders to march unopposed from Anatolia to the Levant. The Muslim rulers in Damascus, Antioch, Aleppo and Mosul prepared to meet the Crusaders ahead, but ended up fighting one another. Meanwhile, Christian forces conquered city after city, but fighting in a strange land did not always go as planned. In Ma'ara, a city in Syria, a lengthy fight came to an end when the French contingent broke the siege. As the starving French crusaders entered the food-stricken city, they resorted to cannibalism and fed on the dead bodies of people and animals alike. Soon, rumors of invading cannibalistic barbarian armies spread across the region. At one point, the word French literally meant cannibal in Arabic, which illustrates how the locals perceived the Crusaders. Further south in Egypt, Fatimid officials who rivaled the Seljuks and were allied with the Byzantines believed that the Crusaders represented Byzantine reinforcements. As such, while the Crusaders conquered Antioch, Fatimid rulers moved against Jerusalem and asserted their control over the city. It didn't dawn on the Fatimids until it was too late that the Christian forces were not allies and were not interested in an alliance. At the turn of the century, in the year 1099, the Crusaders arrived at the gates of Jerusalem and began their assault. Eventually, roughly a month later, the city walls caved and the Crusaders burst into Jerusalem. Fueled by religious frenzy, they went on a rampage and massacred soldiers and civilians alike. None of the city's religious communities fared well. Most of the Muslims were killed straight away, while the Jewish population had taken refuge in a large synagogue that was set ablaze. Even much of the Christian segment of Jerusalem was punished and sent into exile because the Catholic Crusaders saw the Orthodox population as heretics. The shock and horror of the First Crusade and the fragmented political landscape of the Islamic world deeply distressed Muslim communities across the area. People were in need of divine resolution, and to that end, Ash'ari scholar Al-Ghazali stepped up to the forefront of the debate. The Ash'ari school of theology believed that reason was subservient to revelation, while the latter Mu'tazila group adhered to absolute rationalism. Decades earlier, the latter had been banned for political reasons, but pockets of Mu'tazila sympathizers still existed all over the Muslim world. Al-Ghazali believed that violence could not subdue the rival school. It required a battle of intellect. As such, in one of his most acclaimed works, The Incoherence of Philosophers, Al-Ghazali attacked scholars of rational thought and argued that rational philosophy was incompatible with Islamic teachings. More precisely, he classified science into three categories. The first, religious studies, included jurisprudence, theology, Arabic grammar, etc. The second category included traditional faculties of science such as astronomy, medicine, mathematics, chemistry, and others. The final category concerned spiritual and cultural studies such as astrology, esotericism, and palmistry. Al-Ghazali rejected the spiritual and cultural studies and deemed the study of traditional scientific faculties as useful as long as it was pursued for religious purposes. The first category, however, religious studies, was considered the finest because it brought people closer to God. Although some historians say that Al-Ghazali defended reason, the truth is he did so only to the extent that it could be used as an instrument to undermine his opponents. The weight of Al-Ghazali's contributions is emphasized by the fact that many academics consider him as the single most influential figure in Islam after the Prophet Muhammad. Needless to say, Al-Ghazali's work sealed the attitudes towards science in Islamic civilizations. The political elites and the common folk endorsed Al-Ghazali as the Mujaddid, which according to tradition is a person who appears at desperate times to rejuvenate Islam. To that end, the scholar fostered the Ash'ari beliefs into the mainstream culture. Although Al-Ghazali emphasized intellect and denounced violence, his supporters, however, singled out and condemned great thinkers such as Al-Farabi, Al-Biruni, Al-Rawandi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd. Their studies and properties were confiscated, their teachings were deemed heresy, their achievements were twisted, and their books were burnt. Anyone who expressed sympathy with the Mu'tazila was either imprisoned, tortured, or banished. Centuries earlier, the Mu'tazila had lit the flame of enlightenment and paved the way for a vibrant and innovative community of scholars. Some of the greatest minds in the world came from this movement, but in the 11th century, the Mu'tazila faded away in the obscure pages of history. That said, as the books of Ibn Rushd were destroyed, he famously stated that ideas have wings, no one can stop their flight. And so while the flame of enlightenment had been extinguished in the Islamic world, European universities established faculties that focused on the translation of Arabic texts, which would help to expedite the scientific findings during the Renaissance. Meanwhile, as the Ash'ari dogma shifted the mindset of Sunni Muslims, knowledge was seen through the prism of revelation, and many turned away from philosophy and the natural sciences. This change, however, was not abrupt. It would take centuries for the doctrines to sink in, but its process was accelerated by the collapse of the Silk Road and a new threat that emerged from the Far East. By the end of the 13th century, the world had changed. The rationalist Mu'tazila had faded away, and remnants of their school had assimilated into the Shia Muslim creed. Meanwhile, the Ash'ari establishment came to dominate the Sunni Muslim theology. In Iberia, the Muslim domains had been retaken by the Christian forces, who subsequently absorbed the classical and scientific studies of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, as well as the commentaries of Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd, etc. From the former territories of the Cordoba Caliphate, scientific works filtered into Western Europe, finding their way into libraries and monasteries across European cities. In fact, European translations of Arabic texts was so proficient that in the 13th century, the curricula of the universities of Oxford, Paris, and Naples included Islamic sciences. From this practice came revolutionary thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and others. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the mighty Seljuk Empire had been reduced to an empty shell. From the ashes of the Seljuks rose the Khwarezmian Empire, which had conquered parts of Khorasan and Persia. The Khwarezm dynasty of Turkish-Persian tradition skillfully overthrew regional houses and consolidated their power throughout the area. At the start of the 13th century, Shah Muhammad II ascended to the throne of the Khwarezmian Empire. The Shah considered himself a military mastermind and sought to expand eastwards. He conquered the grand cities of Samarkand and Tashkent in modern-day Uzbekistan, and subjugated the kingdoms in Fargana Valley. By 1217, Shah Muhammad II had conquered all the lands between the Persian Gulf and the Sirdarya River in modern-day Kazakhstan. The Khwarezm Shah had heard rumors that further east in the corner of Central Asia, a new mysterious ruler had unified the Mongol tribes. His peers referred to him as the universal ruler, but for the outside world, he was better known as Chinggis Khan. Shah Muhammad II, however, perceived this as an opportunity to expand further east. Rumors had it that Chinggis Khan commanded vast legions of disciplined horsemen, archers, and soldiers, but the rumors also stated that the Mongols lacked siege equipment, which meant that they could not properly besiege fortified settlements. Muhammad II designed his plans along these parameters. He would provoke Chinggis Khan to invade, and once attrition started to take a toll on the Mongol armies, the Khwarezmians would counterattack and conquer the Mongol homelands. Muhammad II believed that he had set a brilliant trap. As such, he deliberately provoked a war and waited for the Mongol Khan to strike first. What Muhammad II didn't know was that Chinggis Khan had just completed a devastating military incursion in China and had acquired the latest technologies in siege equipment. In fact, when the Great Khan crossed the Sirdarya River, about 1,000 Chinese engineers accompanied the Mongol armies. At a force of roughly 150,000, the Mongol armies were not particularly large. However, their tactics, strategies, and the ferocity of their warriors was unlike anything the world had ever seen. For one, they used unique composite bows that could shoot further and harder than the bows used by the regional powers. What's more is that the Mongol horses were smaller, faster, and sturdier, and they were mounted by a people whose entire culture centered around horsemanship. For instance, in times of war, Mongol warriors would slit a minor vein in the horse's neck and drain some blood in a cup which they would drink for nourishment. So the Mongols could eat and sleep in the saddle and travel great distances in remarkably short time, often surprising their enemies. Also, since the Mongols had more horses than manpower, they would often confuse their opponents by mounting dummies on their horses to give the impression of an overwhelming horde. The level of ferocity and unique tactics, in combination with superb horsemen and bowman skills and advanced Chinese siege equipment, made the Mongol armies the most devastating force in the world. The Khwarezmian Empire didn't stand a chance. Once Chinggis Khan destroyed the Khwarezmian armies and fortifications, he razed the occupied territories to the ground. The Great Khan lived up to his reputation as his armies pillaged towns and villages and committed acts of mass murder and atrocities across the Middle East and Central Asia. Great cities such as Bukhara and Balkh and their treasures of Persian literature and scientific volumes were destroyed beyond recovery. In Nishapur and Herat, entire cultures perished as mass murder rose in the hundreds of thousands. In Transoxiana, the underground canal works, which was the agricultural lifeline of southern Central Asia, collapsed. A fertile land turned to sand, which it still is. Within a few years, at least a quarter of the population of Persia and Khorasan had perished. The armies of Chinggis Khan burnt the fields and crops and stripped the common folk of their livelihoods. As famine set in, millions of refugees migrated west. They brought with them apocalyptic stories of a carnivorous species of half-human, half-horse creatures that spread like a plague across the civilized world. None wanted to confront and test the wrath of the Mongols. When Chinggis Khan passed away in the following decades, his successors continued the campaign of extermination. It was a period filled with fear and terror, but at the backdrop of the destruction, Khalif al-Mustasim of the Abbasid Empire held up remarkably well. The Abbasids had regained control over Baghdad, and the Khalif had assembled a significant standing army. In his misplaced confidence, al-Mustasim believed that he could manipulate the new Mongol ruler, Hulagu Khan, to reassert Abbasid authority. So the Khalif sent word to the Khan and invited him to attack his foes. However, the exact opposite happened. Hulagu Khan marched to Baghdad and demanded the Khalif's complete surrender. In his ultimatum, Hulagu Khan wrote the following: "The past is over. Destroy your ramparts, fill in your moats, turn your kingdom over to your son, and come to us. If you do not heed our advice, get ready. When I lead my troops in wrath against Baghdad, even if you hide in the sky or in the earth, I shall bring you down. I shall not leave one person alive in your realm, and I shall put your city and country to the torch." Despite the warning, Khalif al-Mustasim defied Hulagu Khan. As such, in early February 1258, the siege of Baghdad commenced. By the end of the month, the great city had practically ceased to exist. Khalif al-Mustasim had been captured alive and was imprisoned. After a few days of starvation, the Khalif asked the Khan for some food, so Hulagu Khan sent him a platter with gold. When al-Mustasim refused to eat gold, Hulagu said, "If you can't eat it, why did you hoard it? Why didn't you give it to your men who were ready to die for you?" Hulagu then took al-Mustasim to the broken gates of Baghdad and said, "What good are these walls if there are no men to defend them?" Following this interaction, the Mongols rolled up the Khalif in a carpet and trampled him to death by horses. As for the citizens of Baghdad, nobles and common folk alike were decimated, and, true to his word, Hulagu Khan burnt the city to the ground. Mosques, palaces, and hospitals were ransacked. Magnificent libraries, schools, and institutions were destroyed. Millions of documents, parchments, books, and testimonials were burnt and thrown in the river. By some accounts, the river turned black with ink for days. Centuries of accumulated knowledge and records perished in oblivion. The fall of Baghdad marked a turning point in history, but not because of the sheer destruction. The Mongols would eventually be defeated by the Turkish Mamluks in Egypt, and the remnant Mongol houses ended up converting to Islam. But in the same era, another major change had transpired in Europe. The Iberian kingdoms developed advanced carracks with deep-sea navigable capabilities, which allowed them to sail around the southern tip of Africa to reach Asia. As European merchants established new maritime trading routes that bypassed the land passages of the Middle East, it set in motion geo-economic transitions that led to the collapse of the Silk Road. But the decline of the intercontinental Silk Road was not just an economic shift. Trade brought in new information as well as goods and commodities. International commerce kept the Middle East integrated and aware of the outside world, so the Silk Road's exchange of communication was as important as its commercial component. In earlier centuries, a thriving global trade network allowed for the Muslim societies to adapt and utilize new and foreign ideas, which triggered the Islamic Golden Age. Thus, as the Silk Road declined, it also removed the conditions that made the Islamic world a metropolitan civilization. In the post-Mongol Reconstruction era, the decline of the Silk Road dramatically reshaped the attitudes of Islamic cultures. Open-mindedness towards the outside world shifted to rejection, and Muslim communities focused extensively inwards. As the Islamic world reinvented itself, Ash'ari theology became inseparable from the mindset of the mainstream population. At the same time, state madrasas, which in the past helped to spread the ideals of rational thought, focused exclusively on religious studies, such as grammar, the Hadith, and Sharia law, as was recommended by the scholar Al-Ghazali. The Ash'ari concept of occasionalism, which denies the comprehensibility of the physical world, was integrated into the educational system. Meanwhile, legitimate scientific studies were excluded from the curricula. The dormancy of the educational system was a gradual process. By the 14th century, Muslim scholars shifted their focus from innovations to practical inventions. A century later, Europe had replaced the Muslim world as the center for learning and innovation. The performances of Christianity and Islam in the scientific fields were now reversed. Major European events such as the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Reformation, and even the Age of Enlightenment passed unnoticed in the Muslim world. The open-minded Islamic culture that had once produced libraries, observatories, and cities had now regressed into a closed world that was resentful and hostile to innovation. It wasn't until Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 that Muslim communities realized that they were no longer at the forefront of the world. Soon, questions were asked about where a wrong turn was made, and amidst the European colonization of the Middle East, the future looked uncertain, and people idolized the past. It is in this period that Muslim rulers tried to reverse the situation by borrowing Western technology and socio-political ideas such as secularism and nationalism. Others, meanwhile, believed that glory could be gained by returning to the pristine and pious past. The latter mentality proved unable to cope with modernity, and it is best explained by a deep sense of nostalgia for the classic Islamic era without properly understanding the historic developments that occurred at the time. The truth is that the reasons for the decline of science in Muslim communities are plenty, but in general, they can be attributed to political instability, economic decline, environmental change, mass migrations, and the lack of critical thinking due to the triumph of revelation over reason, as well as factors such as the Crusaders and the Mongols. The combination of these conditions set Islamic civilization on a trajectory of self-destruction. Just as we explore the past to search for answers, scholars of the Golden Age analyzed their world as well. Historian Al-Masudi in the 9th century was once asked why science had declined in the Roman Empire whilst the Islamic world had thrived. He answered, "Ancient Greeks and Romans had allowed the sciences to flourish. Then they adopted Christianity. When they did so, they effaced the science of learning, eliminated its traces, and destroyed its paths. Science was defeated by faith." Thank you for staying with us through these episodes. I truly hope that the moral of the story is not lost in animosity. Science, after all, is a continuous product of human civilizations, not by one or two, but nearly all civilizations. So this is truly something to be cherished. Also, I want to thank our contributors for giving us the means to produce original content like this. If you want to be part of our crowdfunding network, or if you're searching for additional perks, visit patreon.com/CaspianReport. In any case, thank you for your patience and Sarol.